IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. Hello, and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, and I'm joined today by my colleague Anushka Saxena, and we will be talking about the future of the Chinese economy in 2024. Before we get to that conversation, first of all, wish everyone a happy new year. Hope 2024 has started well for all of you. It's not necessarily looking like a great year from the Chinese economy's point of view, and we're going to try and discuss that, and also try and think of what are the implications of what's happening in China for India. So if you've not followed the news for the last 10-15 days because you've been on a break, this is a good space for you to catch up on what's been happening with the economy in China. So, Anushka, welcome to this conversation.
Thanks, Manoj. Happy to be here and happy holidays to our listeners.
Okay, so let's begin with the idea that every year at the end of the year, China has a conference called the Central Economic Work Conference. This conference sets the tone for next year's economic work. And you've just done a piece discussing what the conference, what the outcomes of the conference were. So why don't you just take us through a bit of the headlines of what happened at the conference and what can we expect based on that in 2024?
Sure. So thanks for that, Manoj. So yes, at the end of every year, the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, in collaboration with the State Council, convenes the Central Economic Work Conference. And of course, as you mentioned, this conference sets the tone for the economic and financial agenda of the country in the upcoming year. In specific, the priorities for its banking and finance sectors, which is again the monetary and the fiscal policy. And yes, this year a lot of the things that were discussed as per the readout in the media reports pertaining to the deliberations at the CEWC, as well as key highlights from Xi Jinping's speech, indicate that a lot of what was discussed was per usual, but there were some things of note, and I'll be happy to talk about some of them. So the overall sense that I got from the readout and the speeches was that there is the continued emphasis on moving away from being an export-led economy to China becoming a domestic demand-led economy, which essentially forms the basis for dual circulation, where consumption domestically will be the foundational pillar for economic growth, with international demand only supplementing it. And there was also the continued emphasis on moving away purely from high quantity growth to towards high quality growth, because and this is something I talk about in the article as well, which is that in China, the main purpose, or the main source of the derivation of the CPC's legitimacy is from being able to solve the principal contradiction of the century. And under Xi Jinping, the principal contradiction is now addressing the ever growing need of the people for a better life, and balancing it with unbalanced and inadequate development. And so one of the solutions to that is to focus on high quality growth and only have it supplemented by quantitative success, so, and not superseded by it. So that was again one of the key focal points of the deliberations at the CEWC. Apart from that, there was an acknowledgement that indeed the global environment has become unstable, and amidst increased protectionism and de-risking, there is a need to look inwards to boost scientific and technological innovation, to gain self-reliance, especially in the area of high technology, and to move not and to move further from just being at the stage of improvement to actually demonstrating strength. And At the same time, a balance was drawn between not just focusing on between focusing on the high tech sectors, including integration of high technology in manufacturing, as well as focusing on the more rural side of things. So also expanding on agriculture and even making agricultural tech more innovative, more advanced, so on and so forth. And finally, one interesting point that emerged for me was the focus on local government finance vehicles, and how there will be no more bailouts for them, no direct stimulus, but rather this was advised at the meeting that local governments will now have to learn to live in frugality. And of course, in October, the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, during its session, had approved some special bond issuances, which were worth about a trillion yuan, for select local governments, so that they can deal with disaster recovery in the aftermath of a lot of local disasters like floods and droughts. But again, those were only for select governments that had to reel in both the effects of the COVID-19 lockdowns, as well as this disaster resilience work now. But yes, overall, the instruction is that financial discipline will be imposed, and there will be no direct bailouts, neither for local governments nor for the private sector. So I think those are some of the.
That's really interesting, right? I mean, and I want to pick on each of these aspects that you've talked about. But first, let's pick on the last thing that you said, right? That there will be much more fiscal discipline and there will not be bailouts. At the same time, one of the comments in the conference readout was something to the effect of the fact that provinces which are much more prosperous must sort of carry the burden for provinces which aren't doing well, which does tell you that there is going to be some degree of redistribution and bailout support from folks that are doing well to the folks that are not doing well, which impacts incentives, which impacts reporting and all of that potentially going forward. But how is it that the party expects growth when, like you said, you are going to move away from exports and you are going to rely on domestic demand? You don't want to do heavy investments because there is a debt overhang, and you don't want to give that money easily anymore. And conventionally, the model has been export and investment driven. So, if you're going to move away from those two and you're going to rely on domestic demand, and there is absolutely no indication that domestic demand is growing, because China has been caught in some sort of a deflationary cycle. So, in that circumstance, where is it that Xi Jinping is looking at growth coming from?
Right. So I think that's an interesting question, and would be hard to answer, because some of the policies with regards to alleviation of local debt have not really landed, and it's for all of the reasons you mentioned. Right. There are issues with reporting, and there is also political inertia in that local governments understand which policies they might be able to implement, and which of those policy visions is unimplementable, so to say. And so they'll be picking and choosing, and it might not be so that the richer or the more prosperous provinces do indeed enable growth for the others, right? Because all of them have their challenges and there is inertia. So in this regard, I would say that indeed the nature and the ambition of the reforms that Xi Jinping and the CEWC are proposing is expansive, and it's literally moving away from everything, all of the pillars the Chinese economy has been known to stand up on. And at the same time, I also believe that the focus on growth may not be so much as there is a focus on stability of macroeconomic policy. And so I think as per some of the insights from Xi Jinping's speech, there is he also said something to the tune of all ministries that are now releasing policy documents pertaining to macro economics will have to assess the consistency of the content of the regulatory documents, the timing of the issuance, and they have to promote the strengthening of policy coordination and synergy of work, right? So I think there is, at the same time, with regards to foreign trade also, there was a statement in the CEWC readout which said that China now has to focus on promoting balanced trade, which could essentially go to say, in my understanding, that because of both the de-risking sentiment as well as the internal sentiment of moving away from being purely export oriented. China might now want to open up its market more for its important trade partners, may want to reduce some of the trade deficits other countries have with China, so that there is again balanced trade, as the readout puts it. And so I think there is both a focus on stability as well as a focus on gradually moving away from exports by stimulating domestic consumption. Again, like you said, and there is also an acknowledgement that most of the efforts in this regard have been supply side. Stimulating the supply side elements in the investment component of consumption, and that hasn't really done anything to say boost things like retail sales or housing consumption, so on and so forth. But I think we've seen some minor growth in real estate investment, even though overall private investment has gone down by 0.5% year on year. So I think because of the sheer scale and ambition of the reform, and because of the balanced focus on growth as well as macroeconomic stability, it'll take a little time for some of the policies to reflect.
This is interesting, right? I mean, it just tells you a little bit about how two different people can read the same thing that's put out by the Chinese government in very different ways. Because I read it as, like, say, you said that you look at the CWC readout and you think of it as something that is expansive in terms of its nature of reform. I look at it as, and my definition of it would be more continuity, very timid, uh, no real expression of ambition in that regard. And let me explain why I say that. So, firstly, on the issue of export, like you said, and like we've talked about earlier also, there are a lot of the measures to boost domestic demand and consumption are supply side measures. They aren't necessarily demand side measures. The difference for people who may not be aware is essentially the fact that the government is subsidizing companies to produce more, keep people on the payrolls, rather than necessarily providing more money in the hands of the consumer. So if you go back to the pandemic and you think of the American government giving cash transfers or vouchers to people to try and spend more and stimulate spending, so that can stimulate demand, and that demand can then stimulate supply. Here the approach is you're giving money in the hands of companies to produce more, which keeps people on the payrolls, with the expectation that those people, because they are on the payrolls and they are employed, they have cash in hand and they can then go and spend, and that will stimulate overall the cycle of economic growth. What China is seeing today is that that's not happening, because when people are still earning money, they are holding on to that money. They are saving it rather than necessarily spending it. And why you're saving it is because there is uncertainty about the future. And one key part of that is also the fact that the property market is weak, and a lot of your savings are in the property market. So you're not necessarily sure about the value of your savings increasing in the property market. So therefore, you're holding on to the other money that you're having and you're saving it in other instruments as opposed to property, because that's the challenge. So you're not really spending. You're not, so that cycle is not really working. So what happens to all these products that will get manufactured? You will have a supply glut. China's, I think, industrial production, or at least industrial profits, were up some 29% or whatever. Industrial production has also been up for about 3 to 4% around that region. That will likely be exported, because if there is no domestic consumption, either it is wasteful investment or it is going to get exported, which basically means that there is going to be a supply glut even externally, which does away from this idea of moving away from export-led growth. Because if you're subsidizing manufacturing still to that degree, and you don't have the domestic consumption capacity, you're likely to export it much more. And therefore, you're likely to still remain reliant on external demand, and the external demand might be weak, which means that your overall earnings from that export might not be high, but you're still essentially doing that, so your prices will fall. So that's the first thing that when I look at this and I think of that there is nothing that tells me that you're stimulating demand. For that was the first point. The second point was on this point, this bit that you talked about, and I think it was really interesting that you brought that up. This idea of making sure that you strengthen coordination, in fiscal, monetary, employment, industrial, regional, technological, environmental, and all other kinds of policies, and include what are non-economic policies also in the evaluation of the consistency of macroeconomic policy. It's interesting, right? Because I read that as a desire to mitigate any unintended consequences of policies across different domains. So you may do something from an environmental perspective, let's say to cut down on coal and emissions because of coal burning, but the impact on that of that on macroeconomic stability, you need to take into account. I don't see that as a reform measure in that sense of trying to stimulate something, but I see that as or as a reform measure which is not necessarily pro growth. I actually see it as a pro growth measure because you don't want growth to be impeded. You are trying to do this, so it's somewhat muddling through reform, but not necessarily not pro growth. It's actually a measure which tells you that there is anxiety about the growth number, and that's why you're likely to see something like this. At least that was my takeaway, which again is interesting because there are we have very different understandings of what the readout says, which is what is fun about doing this sort of work around China. I'll move forward over the next year. At least there is this level of continuity that we're likely to expect in policies going forward. When it comes to the property market specifically, because that's something that I'm sure is going to be in the headlines over the next year again. And it's so critical to China's old economy, right? Anywhere between different estimates, at 25 to 33, 35% of the Chinese GDP is sort of dependent on the property market. What was your readout of what the CEWC discussed with regard to the real estate sector?
Right. So, of course, some of it, as we discussed, and as you pointed out, was very timid and boring, which was statements about ensuring stability in the financial sector, which is a priority, and stability in the financial sector is intrinsically linked with the property market, and property market stability is intrinsically linked with both the savings of the population, which will in turn stimulate consumption, as well as with local government debt because of the kind of because how financing of their housing projects is dependent on private investment. So a lot of it is interconnected and comes down to, of course, the stability of the property market. And so, as per the readout, maintaining the stability of the property market, stabilizing it is listed as a priority as per the deliberations. Um, and I think the understanding is that stability of the property market is a real challenge that China has not been able to overcome, at least in the past year and a half. And of course, 2022 has been a period when property sector has faced numerous challenges with regards to the inability of owners to pay mortgage. Developers have failed to deliver, so on and so forth, and there is no easing, so to say, in this particular regard. And so I think this is one sector, this is one aspect in which the readout and even Xi Jinping's speech has been really non-innovative, which is that the focus is only going to be on stimulating consumption and having that lead to an expansion in the number of sales of in the sales of housing, and at the same time continuing to ensure financial discipline. So yes, this is one thing that real estate developers might want to take away, which is that there is no sentiment of easing on what they have to deliver. So in amidst the sentiment of ensuring financial discipline for the private sector, the real estate sector will continue to be pounded. And so it is likely that the focus on cutting down on excessive expansion of capital, while at the same time ensuring discipline in delivery for real estate developers, will continue to be a norm. And so I think this is largely what the C.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Yeah, I think I agree. Yeah, I agree with you in in what you said, right? That there was again nothing new. I mean, one thing that was interesting was that the 2022 Central Economic Work Conference included that phrase of houses are for living and not for speculation, and this one didn't. And both of them also made the point, that we need to still devise a new model for the real estate sector, which again is something that, like you said, that they are still figuring out exactly what they need to do. But through the year, there were steps taken, right, to try and manage the challenges, right? So I mean, things like allowing people to renegotiate their mortgage interest rates, reducing the amount that people can pay for down payments in the first amount, so that more people actually purchase property, providing tax breaks to buyers, making sure that the state supports private sector companies in doing, and even SOEs in doing, urban renewal projects rather than just necessarily housing projects and things like that, new housing projects which are wasteful and where you don't have buyers. But then some data points which I have, which tell you that how still the things haven't necessarily worked out, like you said, right? From January to November, funds raised by property sector enterprises fell by 13.4% year on year. Sales by floor area fell by 8% year on year. So whatever steps you took, you didn't necessarily uh, get the kind of outcome where you got increased sales, or you got at least support for the sector. Even new construction fell significantly by about 21%. So that sector continues to remain, and I mean, in my view, also this is purposeful. You're trading this slow growth in this sector to try and focus more on manufacturing, innovation, and, like you said, demand. And one data point to again support that is that through the year, I think property sector investment fell over and all by about 9.4, 9.5%. And if you exclude, and overall, like you said, private sector investment across the country fell by 0.5% year on year. But if you exclude the real estate chunk of that to do a year on year measurement, what you will see is that private investment actually expanded by 9.1%. This was not a substantial amount because the property aspect of it is a substantial amount, but there was an expansion, which does tell you that the government is directing capital in areas that it wants to direct, and it is making sure that capital doesn't necessarily flow into the property sector uh, as much as it doesn't end up becoming that the property sector eats up capital availability. So those traffic lights that the Chinese government talks about, I mean, I think you can see some indicators of what they mean by that we must have traffic lights for capital. The final area that I want to focus on is innovation manufacturing, because that was the first of the 9 points the CEWC talked about, right? That we will have an innovation driven growth model. Do you have any sense of what kind of domains are we likely to see being the focus for this particular aspect, this business of building a modern industrial sector focusing on innovation?
Right. So I think one of the interesting things, and I think I alluded to this earlier in this episode, was innovation in agriculture. So clearly, high tech and manufacturing aren't the only segments that the economy is likely to focus on, especially considering. Agriculture still contributes about 7.3% to the Chinese GDP, about 5% to GDP growth, both as of last year. And so some of the agriculture linked incentives that have been talked about and deliberated upon at the CEWC are to focus on technologically advancing the agricultural production, and it's also giving a boost to the establishment of something they refer to as agriculture innovation centers. And largely from the analysis that I've read, these innovation centers have the agenda of enabling China's achievement of food security by 2035. And this is also so because since the Trump-led trade war, imports of food items have really been a challenge, and something that for China, and something that they're thinking about vis-a-vis self-reliance as well. And so, with agricultural innovation and a focus on really having research and development done through innovation centers. They want to achieve self-reliance in food security. The other thing that, of course, there was a focus on innovation, science, and technological advancement was in high technology, right? And so semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum, and the likes, these were referred to as key areas where China has to achieve self-reliance. It has to continue to innovate. It has to relieve itself from the quote unquote stranglehold that the Western economies have placed on Chinese growth in. And so I think these were the two areas that really emerged when thinking about from the perspective of where we can see innovation in 2024. There was also a talk about innovation in the low end sectors of manufacturing, so that the process of high quality growth is consistent across all verticals of the manufacturing sector. The one line goal, so to say, of innovation for 2024, as was deliberated at the CEWC, is to utilize scientific and technological advancement and innovation to advance the construction of a modern industrial system. So, all of the elements like self-reliance or food security, or even innovation in green technologies and renewable energies, which are a key component of China's domestic security and economic policy outlook, for not just for 24, but in the longer run. All of these pillars come together to constitute what China refers to as a modern industrial system.
Yeah, that's a really nice summary of what I think they're trying to do. And again, let me just add some data to this. Just a quick wrap of what happened last year. So for people who want to understand what they mean when they say a modern industrial system, the idea of, like Anushka said, innovation capability, upgrading of industrial structure in terms of how things are manufactured, linking of digital technology with the real economy, whether it's agriculture, whether it's manufacturing, and promoting, like Anushka said, green development and green technologies, and also making sure that your industries are not as polluting as they have been in the past. That's a key part of green industrial development. Just some things that happened last year which are important in this direction was that, firstly, you had their entire party state institutional reform process that happened in March, which led to the establishment of a Central Science and Technology Commission, which is coordinating now this national innovation system. So there's much more top-down direction and control in terms of priorities, and therefore the CEWC listing of certain domains which Anushka mentioned are important to take into account. In terms of just money flow, one data point that's useful to keep in mind is that, and again, compare this with the property sector decline of investment. Fixed asset investments in high tech industries grew by 10.5% year on year. In of this, high tech manufacturing and high tech services saw an expansion of 10.5 and 10.6%. So that's significant focus in those areas. Industrial value added output grew by 4.3%, which I mentioned earlier in our conversation, that's going to lead to a supply glut. But also the new buzzword has been this three new, right? Solar cells, lithium ion batteries, and electric vehicles, which have been key part of China's exports, right? So and that's also examples of how when you have a supply glut, you will end up exporting much more of it. And this continues to be the case, right? And even with regard to, say, platform economies, the focus has been on making sure that they spend more money on what the state has prioritized. So, Alibaba should spend in AI, but AI aspects in which the state is interested in. And there's an interesting MERICS report which came out earlier this year, which gave us, point by point comparison of where companies have been focusing their spending on because of the state's priorities. And these are essentially consumer technology companies, as not necessarily your hard manufacturing tech companies. Even in the middle of the year, there was a report which, where Li Qiang, the premier, had met with platform companies, and he said, oh, you guys are trailblazers, and so on and so forth. And he used this very rather innocuous sounding phrase that, you must empower the development of the real economy. And what that basically meant is that we are going to give you domains in which you need to go and invest, and we will greenlight those investments. And those came in, like you said, autonomous vehicles, semiconductors, agriculture, new energy. So there's a lot of directing capital which is going to go on. And again, this is something I think important for people to also who've trying to look at what China has been doing with regard to the private sector in the last few years, and reading into it this emergence of a left-wing anti-private sector ideology. I think there's a need for reorientation of that. It's not anti-private sector. It's about making sure that the private sector does what the state wants it to do. So it is, of course, against economic freedom, but it is not anti-private sector. It's not trying to strangle the private sector. So, that leads to unpredictability, such as the most recent last 2 weeks, we've had these gaming rule changes, which wiped off billions, tens of billions for Tencent. So you'll see perhaps more of that, but if you know which areas the state is prioritizing, even for investors, it may not necessarily be as unpredictable as, say, what it was maybe 2 years ago. With that, Anushka, I have 2 last questions for you, and we'll do very brief answers. First question, in March, we will see the NPC. Li Qiang will present his first work report. Last year, the late Li Keqiang presented his final work report. Do you think China will announce a GDP target for the year, given that the GDP is likely to be below 5%? And like you said, they're not necessarily interested in growth as much. Do you think we'll see a GDP target? If it's not sexy enough, why announce it?
See, I think it's traditional that a GDP target be announced. Of course, conventionally, maybe some would consider Li Keqiang to be a more scientifically and pragmatically oriented individual, and so despite having acknowledged the fact that the Chinese economy wasn't doing well, he still announced a target. And from my understanding of the CEWC readouts and the overall attitude towards stimulus packages tells me that the leadership isn't really concerned. They think the Chinese economy is doing just fine and it will continue to stabilize and grow, even if that's not what they really think on the inside, right? And so I'm sure that as a show of strength, there will be a GDP target announcement. And even last year, the announced target was 5.5, but the growth was only 3%, right? So again, even from that perspective, I don't think there is so much worry about whether or not they'll be able to meet the target. But I think the announcement of the target itself is not only tradition, but also a show of maybe strength or certainty or confidence. So yeah, I'll put my bet on the announcement.
Okay, so we'll see at the end of March what happens, because my bet is that we will not see a GDP target this time around for the first time in forever. And I think in our podcast on predictions, that was one of the predictions that I made, that we will not see a GDP target this year. And again, Xi Jinping has broken many norms, and this is Li Qiang's first work report, so he might want to break a norm or two himself. And my second question to you is that we've not seen the third plenum take place, the third plenary session of a new central committee. For folks for whom this sounds really esoteric, every 5 years a new central committee is elected. They have plenary sessions at different points of time. The third plenary session historically has dealt with issues of economics and reform. It was supposed to happen this year as per the timetable in fall. It's not taken place, which is another norm-shattering piece of information. Do we see a third plenary session in your view before the NPC, or are we not likely to see it?
That's a hard one, but yes, as you mentioned, it should have. It's like it should have happened, but it didn't, and that again could be a sign to say that there is nothing new or nothing exciting or groundbreaking that the Chinese leadership perhaps wants to announce or undertake with regards to economic and financial policy, considering the third prelim is where monetary and fiscal policy is discussed. And so no, I don't think we might see one before the NPC and the presentation of the work report.
Okay, so the next 3 months are going to be really fun, because I predict that we will see the third plenary session, and we will see it in late February, just before the NPC. But then we'll wait and see whether that takes place or not. And if that does take place, I will get back to this particular conversation, and I will make sure that you buy me at least a couple of cups of coffee for both my predictions.
Yeah, of course. Anyway, you followed it for longer, so I'm ready to lose.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much, Anushka, for this conversation.
Thank you. Thanks to our listeners for tuning into another episode.
Thank you. If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM podcast app, ivmpodcast.com or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVMPodcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.